Before we dive into our last amazing panel, we are going to watch a short video, and then after that, we're going to dive into closing this out with a discussion of SCD and the forgotten patient. So let's roll the video.
What we can take from that portion of the case study is the marketing mix and how those tools define the firm's objectives. Those tools being product, price, place, and anyone? Promotion. Now that we have those tools defined, let's move on to the next portion of our case study. Application. John, let's have you share with the class. John.
Sorry. Living with sickle cell disease, it's torture. Everyday tasks can be filled with pain.
Hey, you okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. Life with sickle cell disease isn't easy. Each attack could lead to irreversible organ damage. Days like these are all too common. I am one out of every 365 African Americans who have sickle cell disease. It's always with me, and the 100,000 others who have it. You can't see our pain, but please, believe it.
Powerful. We are going to be diving into this area of SCD. For those of you expecting Greta Van Susteren, her plane did not take off due to the weather. So me, Jeremy Abbott of Scientific American, I will be moderating this. I found out about an hour ago. But as luck would have it, about a year ago, we published a special issue on this topic. And some of the folks here had played a role in that. So I'm proud to introduce this amazing panel. I will quickly go through the panel, and then we'll take a question from a patient voice, and then start digging into this. So next to me, Dr. Ifeyinwa, you are the Chief Patient Officer and VP Rare Diseases, Novo Nordisk, and the Director of the Sickle Cell Transitions Program. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Dr. Olivier Hermine, you are head of the Department of Hematology at Necker Hospital in Paris. Thank you for making the trip to New York.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Melissa Creary, Scientific American author and subject of an interview. Thank you for participating. You are Associate Professor of Health Management and Policy and Global Public Health at the School of Public Health, University of Michigan. Thanks again for coming out today. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Solomon Ofori-Acquah, Professor of Pediatrics and the Calvin Smyre Endowed Chair, GRA Eminent Scholar, and Director, Georgia Solve Sickle Cell Initiative at Emory University School of Medicine. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
A stellar brain trust, to be sure, but I want to make sure if there is a patient voice that would like to ask the first question, please go ahead and do so. You can use my microphone.
It can be.
No, there's a mic. Thank you. Hello.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to our panelists and our moderator for stepping in. My name is Olaide Adekanbi. I'm the founder of Soundrest. We aim to develop an ultrasound product to help patients with sickle cell with our pain. And so my question is, you know, we're here and we're talking about patient involvement in, you know, our own care at all levels. And I feel like, you know, we all know like sickle cell is such a model for all diseases. And so one thing I wanted to ask you is that as, you know, we have been a model in scientific discovery for all diseases, in, you know, community creation, how can we as sickle cell patients or within the sickle cell disease, how can we create a new model for patient involvement in advocacy in a way that hasn't been seen before, so that we can, lead the way for other rare diseases to follow us.
You stole the theme of my panel.
I'm so sorry.
You want to come up here?
In a few years.
Thank you for that. That's exactly, I think, a great jumping off point. How can this be a model for patient engagement? I think, and again, I'm not an expert, but I'm going to throw this out to the group. It has all the ingredients of something that we should use as a learning tool. There's a lot of innovation. There is a hidden population. There's a disproportionately affected population. There are exciting things, but there are huge challenges to access. There is the need for community engagement, and what does that look like? There is the need for patient voice at all stages of this. So if we are going to think about SCD as a model going forward for how we can involve the patient in all stages to develop better innovation that actually gets to patients, what would be the first step or your biggest priority? I'll start over with you, Solomon, just because we had such a lively discussion in the lobby, and I know you have very strong opinions about this.
Thank you guys, and thank you for hanging on to this last panel. So I will address the question by challenging the premise of the question. Because typically when we think of a model, it's something that you use as an example, and then it's really only when it works that you then propose it as a model. And sickle cell disease has been used as a model way back. For those of you who are not aware, it was the very first human disease for which we knew the cause was a genetics. So it's been known as a prototypical genetic disease from the very beginning. It was one of the first diseases that gene therapy was attempted. And in so doing, it helped us to understand how all genes are regulated. It gave us the concept that the proximity of a gene, all the elements that control expression of the gene, are not in the proximity. We identify something called a locus control region, which is 20 kilobases away. So sickle cell disease has been a model for a long time. And yet, it remains very challenging in terms of care, what is right for patients, the advancement. And so before we push it up to become yet another model for which other diseases can benefit from, I think we have to look critically to see it's been a model for all these years, and yet major problems still remain. So I would turn the question around to be one where we've been a model for a long time and haven't got a whole lot for it. So how do we really understand the disease, fix the problems that we know exist, before we push it up to be yet another model for a new way of care? I think it's been a model long enough that we need to have to start to see some benefits before we push it up to be a model for another paradigm.
Thank you. Melissa, do you want to opine on this, particularly through the lens of policy, public health? I think that part of the conversation is always within this idea of patient centricity, but how specifically do you think we could use the levers of policy, again, as an example for what can be done for patients?
Thank you for the question. I also want to note that in addition to all the things that you named about me, in the program you may see that it says patient yet to be determined. I am that patient, so I'm a patient. She's been determined.
Now determined.
I am determined. I am a patient and patient advocate person living with sickle cell disease, and so I want to take this answer from the lens of my background as a policy professor, but also as someone who has been living and working with the disease for many, many, many years, i.e. since I was born. And I will say that in terms of the public health landscape, it's about data for action, and that action is the policy piece. And we've been having a lot of conversations, to Solomon's point, about data over and over and over again. In fact, we have some of the same conversations we've been having from the very beginning in 2025. So I propose that we figure out how to actually put, someone said it earlier in the last session, how do we put that data back in the ownership of the patient population? How do we put it back so that it's currency? Someone said it's currency. I loved that because everyone wants the data. And we as a patient population have to understand the power of it, how to mobilize around it, and then to use it for our good. And we have to, and we already are savvy enough, but we have to form the partnerships with people in order to make sure that that data use is then returned in our benefit and not just everyone else's benefit, which means we need to have more open conversations with partners and with ourselves as civil society to understand exactly what the data is and exactly what it is we need to do with it. And then it's not about clinical trial endpoints. At least that can't be all of it. It has to be about quality of life for this patient population at the end of the day.
Great answer. Olivier, do you want to talk a little bit about what you see lies ahead as the challenge and the opportunity to translate this into a real living, breathing, better case study so that we can improve this whole system?
Well, first I would like to thank to be here today, and I think we have to change also the paradigm when we do see patients with sickle cell disease, because as a physicians, usually what we look at objective symptoms. And when the patient has some pain, which may impair significantly their quality of life, their capacity to work and to interact socially, is not seen by the physician, who sees the patient sometimes only 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour in this consultation. But then the patient lives with the disease 24 hours every day. And the perception and the impairment of the quality of life has to come from the patient and not from the physician, which is the invisible way of taking care of patients. We change the paradigm. Obviously, we do see patients coming with strokes or vaso-occlusive crisis or acute symptoms, but it's not the whole pictures of sickle cell disease. And second of all, I think when you look at the overall the life expectancy of patients with sickle cell disease, is still even in Europe or in the US, about 40, 50 years old, which is quite short. And when I look myself as a physician working also with malignant disease, when a patient came at 40 years old with a leukemia, for example, we said, okay, this patient, we have to do a bone marrow transplantation because he will die in 1 year if we don't do such a bone marrow transplantation. And we know that bone marrow transplantation can cure patients with sickle cell disease, but the endpoint has sometimes 20, 30 years later. And earlier we do that, better is the procedure if we have a sibling donor, for example. So, and the third thing that we have also to take into account is better awareness of physicians and medical students on sickle cell disease. I remember during my medical school, I did only maybe half an hour class with sickle cell disease. It was part of the small part of anemia, and that's it, and nothing. And then we forgot, we don't see anymore. So I think it might be more important to teach a student what is sickle cell disease, and as a physician and scientist also have a better look of sickle cell disease, because we look at the red cells disease, but in fact there's a lot of interaction with endothelium and also inflammation. And what we do see in patients with sickle cell disease looks like most of the inflammatory disease in which we take care of the patient because of this inflammation, but not in sickle cell disease. And we can debate on that after if you want. But I think we have to change the paradigm both to take care more of what the patients are thinking of their disease and the physicians think about the disease, which is more important, I think, and look at the long run of the quality of life and survival expectancy of these patients.
So there's improvement on the clinical side, both in the interactions with patients, but also the training and how we even talk about the disease. I think it's something I'd like to dive into a little bit more. If you are on the company side, the innovation side, and yet you, I'm assuming, have a pretty intense opinion about the patient voice within that process.
Yeah, and I do, and it comes from my diverse background of being not just a hematologist, but a lifespan sickle cell disease physician for over 30 years, being a caregiver of people living with sickle cell disease from a personal side and professional side, but also being originally from Nigeria, the country that has the largest sickle cell disease population in the world. And in my medical school days, we saw malaria, we saw sickle cell disease. But to answer your question, Olaide, I think we need to excuse the sickle cell disease community from being the source of the model that works, kind of piggybacking on what Solomon said. I think, like he said, we've been enough of a model for science. I think it's time that we benefit from somebody else's model that worked. And a model that I would recommend we look at is not cystic fibrosis, is not hemophilia, it's HIV. HIV has a stigma, the multi-system impact, the global spread, and it's been tackled to where when I was in medical school, we had an HIV ward, and today, some of us might have HIV and it's not a big deal, it's a chronic disease. I think we deserve to get to that level of acceptance and uniformity where it's no longer a stigma. And I want to piggyback on something that Melissa said. You know, when you think about the HIV model, what worked was that they went from dealing with stigma to being an empowered patient community that drove the innovation that helped to drive new treatments and access to care. They also leveraged intersectionality. So I'm not just a doctor, I'm not just a caregiver. I also work in industry, and the reason I joined industry was because they needed to understand the clinical side a little bit, not just during an ad board and talking to doctors outside of the business, but having me embedded in the system so that I can watch and see and inform some of our processes that can make it much more patient-centric. But also, what can we learn from economics? What can we learn from the business people? What can we learn from the computer folks? What can AI do? It can't just be the sickle cell community working for sickle cell disease community to solve sickle cell problems. It's every community supporting us with what they've innovated on to help improve our process and our outcomes. And then the last thing is treatment literacy to unlock access. The biggest gap in sickle cell disease is not that we don't have innovation, is that we don't understand the clinical and true lived impact of the disease. The doctors don't get it. Most of the patients don't really understand it. They feel it, but they can't express it. And the rest of the community and society doesn't understand it either. So how can we make all this wonderful data and science more understandable, digestible, and accessible to the regular, everyday person? I think that's from an industry perspective. Now, the PSA is an example of good patient engagement. Developed by Pharma Therapeutics and Novo Nordisk company, the idea came from the sickle cell disease community. The models, the message, the tone, the vibe, the feel came from the community. We had so many iterations because they refused to sign off on it until we got it just right. And that's what true patient engagement should look like. For you, with you, and by you. And then the dissemination is by the community as well, right? And so there are models that work. I want us to copy those models and not make a new one.
Well, you bring up HIV/AIDS, that seen as one of the biggest examples of patient advocacy on every step of the way, affecting change. And so I think there's probably a lot of models we can learn from. But what you said at the end of your comments, this is in some ways will always be a scientific challenge to innovate better and better, but it's a public communication problem. And going back to something, Solomon, you said to me in the lobby, patient engagement is something that we define sometimes, but it's something we need to understand how patients, and I'm looking at you also, Melissa, you as a patient, I mean, how do we engage with them? What defines patient engagement? It's kind of this ambiguous term. So even that needs to be a little bit deconstructed for us to do it meaningfully in different communities, in different countries, and for different disease states. So how do we change this model? And what is your vision of a more open-ended version of community and patient engagement?
This conversation is already very exciting. And I like what Ify said about adopting a model that appears to have worked, and for one, sickle cell disease using another model. The biggest difference, and I will answer your question, the biggest difference between sickle cell disease, which again I said is not only the first human disease that we knew is caused by genetics, but also the #1 genetic disease in the world. And just to throw some names, some of you may know Francis Collins, former NIH director. Some of you may know Tom Maniatis. Some of the great minds started their work, either PhD or postdoc, working on the sickle cell gene. So it's not a disease that we don't know much about. But the question then becomes, how come we know so much about this disease, and yet we have not moved as far as we want to move? And I want to give you a couple of statistics. We all know about the COVID infection. Within less than a year of COVID becoming a problem, a whole plane full of vaccines landed in Ghana to give everybody a COVID vaccine. I was in Ghana when that first shipment arrived. HIV is a good model. The biggest problem in my mind as to why sickle cell disease hasn't got much attention is because it's not an infectious disease. Nobody's going to catch it. So whenever there's an infectious disease, there's a lot of effort. Malaria is another example, where there's a lot of effort to make. Ebola is another example. If we sit here right now and we wake up tomorrow that there's an Ebola breakout in the most remote part of the world, there will be a lot of effort to try and stop that Ebola, restrict it to that little piece of the world where it is, for a very simple reason. Well, we don't want that virus to get on a plane and infect other people. So in as much as HIV is a good model, we have to understand that it has something inherent in it that sickle cell does not. It's an infectious disease. And the world's attitude to curtailing infectious disease is very different from a disease that other people are not going to catch. It does not mean we cannot learn from HIV. One of the ways HIV was controlled, certainly in East Africa, was to have not a vertical system where you just fly in, you do some stuff and leave, but to have a lateral system.
Yep.
The same is true for malaria.
Yes.
And there's a lot of investment in training of people within the regions where the disease is endemic so they can contribute. And it goes to community engagement. There are MRC units for malaria in the Gambia, in the Uganda, in Tanzania. There are HIV centers of excellence in Nigeria, in Kenya, all over the place. Until recently, the NIH seemed oblivious to the notion that the epicenter of sickle cell disease is in Africa. There is not a single center of excellence for sickle cell disease supported either by the Wellcome Trust, NIH, or any big funder. So sickle cell disease has sort of, I think the theme of this thing here is no decision for me without me. And I will even expand on that because sickle cell, and as much as patients suffer, some of the suffering falls on their patient, on their family. And there's a lot of family support. So I would say it's actually no decision for us without us. If we invest in regions where the disease is endemic, we invest in centers of excellence, we invest in infrastructure to understand the disease better, that is our way to meaningful community engagement. Because you can't really engage patients when you are not engaging the communities that they come from. I see sickle cell disease as really a community disease. And if we really invest in the communities where it's a problem, there are a ton. And I'm going to get to what excites me right now in the sickle cell field. What excites me is, as an educator, I know there are increasing number of researchers that are doing research, are graduating with PhDs, who come from the sickle cell community, including sickle cell patients. If we can find a way to increase the number of new young investigators in sickle cell disease from communities where the disease is endemic, that will be one approach to try to A, engage patients, and B, get folks who have a different motivation to trying to find answers to this problem, which has been with us for a long time. Everybody knows about it. everybody knows about it, including governments in Africa. They know about it, but are doing very little because they haven't been, well, they haven't been pushed to do it. I'll stop there.
I think the push is a great example. I mean, you note infectious disease comes with it, the societal reaction. And suddenly, like with COVID, we really understood that international communities are inextricably linked. We didn't feel that there was this disease so far away. And I think that perception remains for diseases that are not infectious in nature. Olivier, you know, I think there's some examples in France too. There's the Red Cell of Excellence National Network and some other examples of how public information can be disseminated more effectively, public education. Is that something that's needed in this space, you think?
Yes, I like to tell this story. When I came in my university as a young fellow, and my dean told me, if you want to have a professorship position, don't work on red cells, because red cells doesn't interest anybody. You will never publish paper in the good journals, so you will not competitive, so forget that. Do cancer, do immunology, do infectious disease, but no red cells. So I did so, in addition to the rest. And what we have done, we first put together a cohort of patients to understand much better the history and the course of sickle cell disease, because I realized that most of the physicians and scientists don't talk together sometimes, and they don't know what might be the best question to ask to treat this patient. So first we did a big cohort of patients, and based on that we can make a lot of clinical study which increase awareness of the disease. And then doing a collection of samples and doing some lab work, and we get to find new way to attack and to tackle the sickle cell disease, and a lot of specialty, because you know sickle cell disease is one single gene mutation with a lot of consequences, including almost all organs of the body, including the brain, the heart, the lungs, everything. So we can tackle and foster to gather all specialists around sickle cell disease, which is a paradigm of the disease. And I tell the students, you know, immune disease, cancer is very interesting. But look at sickle cell disease. The physiology is quite complex, of one single gene, all of these complications. And all specialty, you may be very interested by working on sickle cell disease. And then, when you know the cohort, you know which drugs you may develop in this patient and which technology you should go. And you have the pool of patients that benefit the most of the study you have done in the past. And since the last 20 years in my university, I still 5 or 6 now medical students become professor on sickle cell disease, and research also become director of laboratory on sickle cell disease. So we get a big awareness, and we try to gather people from all specialties, from pediatrics to old specialists to pregnant women, which is a big problem also. And on top of that, you need to educate patients, educate physicians, educate taxpayer, and educate everybody, and to have a big cohort, and that patients see physician every 6 months at least. What we push, and then we can see what's going on to the patient to try to increase the overall survival of this patient without any innovations. And then you can start to do innovation.
So you need to de-silo the clinical crowd here, right? And so I'm hearing communication coming up as a common theme. You know, Melissa, you were a patient before you were a professional. Do you feel you were engaged with, well, what's lacking? I mean, we are in an era where we have so much information at our fingertips. We've solved the problem of we don't have enough information. Now we have too much information. So we trust peers, we trust people that we know, maybe in our community, friends, you know, relatives or physicians we trust. What would be a better model of communicating so that there is trust?
I'm glad you asked me, because I wanted to bring it back to the idea of community engagement, because there's a huge field of scholarship around community engagement. I recently wrote a paper called The Public Performativity of Trust.
Wow.
Yes, and had thoughts about the last session. as a result of that paper. And I think that at the core of community engagement, at the core of the patient population wanting to live a whole life, understanding that that whole life is dependent on this ecosystem of stakeholders, we have to be open about the things that particular populations need. One of the things I think that was missing from that paper that we discussed the last session, the Credo, is justice. Justice was missing from that paper, and I think when we when we center justice, we begin to understand that we can't make assumptions of what that justice needs to look like for the patient population without truly engaging with them. And that true engagement is about a very long-term relationship that is fostered, that doesn't get abandoned when a drug doesn't get financial backing, that doesn't get abandoned when, sorry, Ify, patients will have providers that then leave for industry. I love you. But there's this ecosystem of need that is present and necessary, and we don't have the open and real conversations about understanding the deep equity processes that have to be involved in order to deliver the justice that we all say we want to do and we want to be a part of, and we want to deliver. So if we're thinking about a justice-centered, trauma-informed kind of community engagement, it means peeling back, the fact that beyond a 5-year NIH grant, I have to be able to get into the community and have real long-term conversations. And I have to be able to deliver something to this patient population that is not going to benefit me. It may benefit me down the road, but it also may never benefit me, but I still have to show up. What does consistency look like? How do we understand the trust that's already been broken over decades and decades and decades of time? Instead of saying, oh, we have to earn that trust, we have to first understand, recognize, and honor the distrust that is already present. So once we begin to have these open, honest conversations with ourselves, then I think we can change the landscape of community partnership.
Yeah, great point. Do you want to comment from the...
Yeah, and I think that's where the rubber meets the road, because in industry, it's hard to do that. It's not an individual's decision whether a company does that or not. It's not a function's decision whether the company does that or not. And it's something that, me going into industry, I had to learn that it's more complicated. It's like, when we say, relationship, it's a complicated relationship. It's a very complicated relationship. But I think that doesn't mean that it cannot be done. I think acknowledging it, bringing it to the table, talking about it is the first step. But I want to also circle on the part you guys mentioned about knowledge, awareness, and education, and then the pull, right? It's one thing that science pushes innovation, but without that trust, there's not going to be a pull by the community to take on the innovation. You might have good food in your restaurant, but if I don't like you, I'm not going to eat your food, right? The same thing with drugs and innovation, right? And so how do we build that trust, but also provide information that allows them to even begin to discuss trust with us? I'm going to share some numbers with you guys. There's 8 million people with sickle cell disease around the world, we think. I'm sure it's going to be more than that. That means that about 1,024 of them are going to die every day. So yesterday we lost 1,024. By the end of today, we're going to lose 1,024. The patients kind of know this on a subliminal level because this is their life. But the innovators, do we really know this and acknowledge it? Do doctors know this? Because if you did know this, you're not going to sit on your acidosis and say, me come back in 6 months and not try to address my issues proactively. Average lifespan is 20 to 30 years in a high-income country, lower than everybody else. In my country, Nigeria, 16 years old, they're like, oh, you're so happy you're alive, right? getting to school is a problem, graduating is a problem, going to work is a problem, keeping a job, retiring in a job at the age of retirement and not early. So this is information that is there, but how many of us know it? And how are we communicating it in a way that we understand it and it actually influences how we act? Not just us on this side, but the patients and their caregivers and their family members. Do patients understand, and do we communicate, and do we treat people as if their disease is a chronic, life-altering, long-term disease, or do we act as if it's a short-term, acute crisis? I take me to the ER, and then once I leave, I'm all better until the next time I show up, right? So these are the things we have to begin to talk about and amplify, because it's not as we've depicted it. It's more complicated, and I really would want to push the community to force us to tell the story of what the disease really is and what the disease really looks like and how you feel and experience it in real life, and not just it's a one gene mutation that causes Galien to go to glutamine, blah, 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 blah. And yeah, I think you want to say something, but I can go on and on.
No, I would love for you to comment. I just want to say, to me, that sounds like the challenge, the gauntlet being thrown down to industry is not just solving this genetic problem, but it's solving for all the challenges around lifestyle, symptom management, unique to each patient, whether that's pain, right, whether it's the logistics of getting to a job, having to call out sick because you are suffering from pain in a crisis.
Non-medical drivers of health.
Right, all
Yes.
of those, but that
And thinking
also is the innovation.
proactive
Right?
wellness care as opposed to treatment of disease, right? How do we keep our sickle cell individuals as healthy as possible and not wait for a crisis, and I hate that word, for us to act, right? It has to be not just dealing with the crisis. That's like at the bottom of the stream, right? Let's tackle this upstream and help them live well and live better and live, fulfilled lives, as Melissa had just mentioned.
Would rising to that challenge fit into the business model that industry adheres to now?
It can.
It can.
It should.
It should, yeah.
I have
Good.
a job.
I'm glad you do. Olivier, you wanted to comment on this?
Yes, it's what I said before about the cohort. When we ask patients what their real problems, and the problem is not, the vaso-occlusive crisis, and the first is the pain, obviously, but then the fatigue, cognitive dysfunction, the social interaction which are decreased, is that patients are suffering. Now, if you want to innovate, you go to see the pharmaceutical companies and also the regulators. They said, what will be your endpoint? You say, well, the endpoint will be increase 1 gram of hemoglobin. Yes, but doesn't change that much to the patient.
Suffering, yeah.
We don't care. But, and then look at the survival and early aging of sickle cell. We have to decrease that. Endpoint is 40 years, 20 years.
Pay for that, yeah.
So nobody wants to go to the clinical trial for 20 years, so it's gone. So it's very difficult to go. And when you know the cohort, when you say exactly the number you said, 16 years old or 37 years old in Europe, the life is very short. I mean, if you look at the cancer patient, you say dying at 37 years old is quite unacceptable.
Yes.
And now we know for sickle cell disease, I was coming back to bone marrow transplantation, which is only today curative procedure to the patient. And when you go with a good donor, and in infancy, we have 95% overall survival at 20 years, which is quite good. But it's very expensive, it's complicated, so it's not realistic to do bone marrow transplantation to everybody. So now we came to what the patients are suffering most. And as you said, it might be inflammation, endothelial dysfunction, red cells also problems, and we can tackle all of these problems. But with one single drugs, with one single endpoint, we will not resolve the whole story. And we need some combination and to understand much better, which is very difficult in terms of, not science, but in terms of regulatory, and convince also pharmaceutical company to go in this direction together to improve significantly the lifestyle and the life expectancy and the quality of life of the patients.
Maybe we bring the patients in, right? We give them the autonomy and the audience to help drive that with us. And I think academia, we've been a little bit more egotistical in thinking that we have to solve the problem ourselves. But maybe we, as a collective, solve the problem, and not just you, me, the science folks, and the innovators and sponsors.
The burden of innovation has never been on one actor. There's been industry, there's been upstream research funded by government in the old days. There has been, of course, physicians on the ground and community health networks. They can all play a role in this, right? I mean, when you think about just one element of this ecosystem industry, you know, speaking just for America, health is both a business and it's a right. And I know the two sometimes butt heads. What, it's not a right?
Sometimes.
Okay, butt heads. But in an ideal situation, industry helps to scale things, research, right, helps to discover, it gets disseminated. I know this is kind of a fairyland pipe dream, but are we getting there? Because there is a lot of excitement around, again, just the innovation in this space. And I know you're a skeptic, Solomon, but you're a realist, and you want to keep this authentic. So let me know how best we can move forward. And what are you excited about something?
Oh, I'm excited about the wave of young scientists that are coming into the discovery space, who are coming from communities endemic with sickle cell disease, including sickle cell patients themselves. Just 2 weeks ago, I was involved in a sickle cell patient who got a PhD in sickle cell disease with an interest in sickle cell kidney disease. And 2 years ago, I was back in that same university, a very small university in Europe, where they graduated actually three PhDs in sickle cell disease. I think this is not an industry problem to solve, and I want to throw a couple of numbers. So in Ghana and in most of West Africa, and hear this correctly, 1 out of every 50 live births has sickle cell disease.
Wow.
Okay? It's actually 1.86%. It's like 2%. There's not a 0.86 of a percent, so let's run it up to 2%. That's 1 out of every 50. Now, another number, 2006. 2006 is when the World Health Organization passed a resolution laying down 8 recommendations for countries in which sickle cell disease is a problem to address sickle cell disease. It also had 5 recommendations for the WHO General Secretary. That was 2006. Yeah. I know for a fact that not a single African country has implemented WHA 59.20. So when we have this discussion, overlooking, is that the Hudson, whatever it is? Is that the Hudson River? Whatever it is. When we have this discussion in this sort of forum, and with all due respect, I think it's important, but it's really not being heard by those who can have a major impact.
Yep, it's true.
So to me, I think we have to shake whatever trees we can to engage authorities where 1 in 50 of live births have sickle cell disease. Yeah. And adopt a bottoms-up approach. I think a bottoms-up approach is sustainable. People can relate to it, right? In Ghana, every single baby gets immunized. Every single baby. In fact, the immunization rate in developing countries, I hate using that word, is higher than in the US. Cuba is like 100%. So there are health programs that resource poor, that's a better, resource poor countries are very good at doing. Every single baby gets immunized.
Amazing.
And yet, in those same countries, there's no sickle cell screen for the babies. Right. And so if there are ways to really have a transformative public health impact on sickle cell disease, it's about engaging authorities where this is a problem and shake the trees and get them to build lateral expertise and infrastructure that will then create that transformative ecosystem for them to be part of the solution. you don't have any problems with malaria clinical trials, and they are done in Africa. You don't have any problems with HIV clinical trials, and they are done in Africa. In fact, in South Africa, at one point, when HIV was so prevalent, as I understand, they tried to find ways to use organs from HIV-infected patients for transplantation. They became innovative to try somehow clean the organ of HIV and to use it for transplant. It was a bottoms-up approach. They had no choice. And so I think when we have these conversations, we have to embrace a little of humility that, we are sort of talking heads, and it's fine. But the real problem is find a way to get this to the places where decisions, it says no decision for me without me, but it depends on where are you making this decision. And I think those decisions have to be made in regions of the world, not just Africa. India is one, where it's a public health problem. And those in charge either are oblivious or they are allowed to get away with it. I come back to COVID. Everybody was jumping up with COVID.
I'll take that as a call to action, because that was going to be one of my nuggets for you guys. But Melissa, I know you want to comment, and then I'm going to, in the spirit of lateral communication, open up the Q&A, because I know if we go over time, they're going to lock the doors. So, yes. What do you want to comment first, and then we'll do a question?
I will try to be very brief. I just want to say one of the things that excites me about this conversation about innovation is that no matter what, innovation is going to keep going. It's going to keep happening no matter these conversations. And it's the scientific innovation that occurred in sickle cell that allows me to still be here. It's the innovation that occurred, with the sickle cell disease program being initiated in the 70s at NIH that gave that initial bolus of information and data. And it's why we see so many people surviving into 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And we have a new problem where we have to figure out what to do to make sure that the patient population as it ages gets increased quality of life. And so I just want to say that one of the things that excites me is the promise of new data. I have a mild genotype, but a really complicated, serious phenotype. And I rely on that data and scientific advancement to think about how can I extend my life the next 20, 30, 40 years in its highest potential as possible. And so all of these conversations about innovation are great. Innovation needs to keep happening. Innovation will keep happening. But we do have to be intentional at all times about how we can make sure it is in service intentionally with the voice of the patient population at its center, at its core.
That's a great point. I'm going to open it up to the crowd. I know you have a burning question, my friend.
I have more than one burning question.
Well, this is the lightning round.
So the first thing I'd like to say is that, the title of this panel was The Forgotten Patients. And we've talked about approximately 100,000 patients in the US and maybe a similar amount in Europe. And if he was kind enough to say there are 8 million patients globally, what about the other 98% of the patients? Do we simply not give a shit because they can't afford it? Let's get real. We've got to tackle this disease from a completely different position. And separately from that, we've got to understand what makes sickle cell disease such a terrible disease. It's not the genetics. We have them anyway, and we can change that easily, and we can do gene therapy on 8 million people. So we've got to understand what this situation really is. And what it really is it starts with something I'd like to call systemic basal inflammation, low-grade inflammation that's there all the goddamn time. And then, from time to time, you have peaks in that inflammation. They can be brought on by a simple thing like stress at work or at home, or physical stress, or some other illness that co-commits, to causing that stress. And so we've got to be very, very realistic and understand that we need the type of drugs that modulate that inflammation and then stop whole blood coagulation. So we had 3 big drugs. We had Pfizer's thing that just failed in phase 3. We had Oxbryta, which killed a bunch of patients and was stopped. And we had Novartis's Adakveo, which was also taken off the market because it was bullshitting and wasn't doing anything. So we got to be very, very real, okay? So we got to find drugs that, first of all, modulate inflammation, and second of all, take away those inflammation peaks. There are drugs like that available right now. We worked on one of them recently with the NIH. We finished a phase 2 study, and we're shortly going to start a phase 3 study. And at Cursus, who sponsored this panel, we plan to set up a foundation separately because some of these drugs are used for much more expensive indications, and then supply them to that foundation at minimum cost for the people who really fucking need them. Excuse my language.
Can I get that signature on a piece of paper?
I thought the systemic was going to be something else.
There's ground up right there. Are we in a position where we need to widen the lens of what drug and therapeutics we involve in this?
We can go as wide as we need to go as long as somebody gets served, right? And so I need to meet with you and get that on paper and writing, and then I need to talk to all the sickle cell disease advocates here to figure out how to make sure that what he's proposing and what we discussed here actually gets to real people. But I think we want to have...
Lightning round, okay, if you can keep our questions as concise as possible.
It's working. It's
Sorry, I think
working.
it's working. Yeah,
It's working.
It's working.
Hello, my name is Yao Upokoloko. I'm from Ghana, and I have sickle cell hemoglobin SS. I'm 62 years old. I've been at the NIH since 2001. Since 2001, that's when I started clinical trials, studies. We've done even studies all the way to Viagra. We've done all the studies. But this is the question. You've got Dr.
Ofori-Acquah.
Answers most of what I was going to say. Dr.
Ifey.
Hermine, right? Also as a patient also. The question is this. Doctors, you guys are doing your best. Trust me. You guys are doing your best. We the patients, we don't take our disease serious enough. It looks on the surface like we are taking it serious, but we don't. I mean, we got to exercise. We got to eat well. So if you have a friend who's a patient, you say, you know what, we live in a neighborhood. Come on. Let's go for a walk. I ride my bike 3 miles every day. Every single day. I drove from Maryland to this place. The moment I live here, I'm going to drive back. 62 years, it's sickle cell SS. But the thing is, we don't want to say the truth. We are always going around. Do you know how many seminars that has happened? Just quite recently, sickle cell conference, and that it was virtual. And I was telling the heads, one of the doctors, I said, look, I was looking at it, I'm looking at the number of viewers, 289. When they bring a topic like glaucoma, then it drops to 170. Then they keep coming, people just get off the forum. Man, it's not going to happen. We have to tell ourselves the truth. It's a terrible disease. It's a tough disease. I have 2 nieces. One is SC, one is AS. But the AS, after me I'm AS, and I tell the mom, I say, hey, mom, listen to the forum.
Yes, yeah, there's one.
So that you are aware of what is going on. We have to advocate for ourselves. You guys will do all you can, but if the patient, clinical trials, this, that, it is, excuses here and there, I mean, it's not gonna fly.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Self-advocating. Yeah. One more short one.
Okay,
Yes.
I have a
okay.
I have a short one.
Okay,
My
thank you.
name is Zachary Limantingiri. I'm originally from Niger in France. I was born with sickle cell disease, cured from sickle cell disease through a bone marrow transplant, and built a chatbot that answers patients' questions on sickle cell disease on WhatsApp. 10 years ago, the life expectancy gap between patients in Nigeria and France, for example, was 30 years when I had my transplant. It's still approximately the same gap, and life expectancy difference between patients in the US and people who don't have sickle cell disease is about 23 years. My question to the panel is, what do you think that gap is going to be 10 years from now? Thank you.
Will we close the gap in 10 years, and why? Real quick.
Quick run.
Quick round of how we're going to close that life expectancy gap in these countries.
I go back to what I've been saying all along, that I'm excited by the number of new investigators in the field who are, and I think the way we close the gap, I'm not going to answer it in terms of a drug, but can we close the gap? Okay, time is finished.
Your time is up, dude.
Let's close the gap by really engaging the global community. This is not a US thing or a UK thing, it's a global disease. And let's close the gap by getting the person in the remotest part of the world, when somebody says, do you know your status? It shouldn't be about HIV. It should be about sickle cell disease.
Olivier, closing the gap.
Yeah, just to come back to, I think first will be education.
Yes,
Education.
absolutely.
Yep.
To patients, to physicians, to scientists, and to regulators, and to industrial partners. This is very important. And then to have real life study, because we can make some small endpoint to register some drugs, but then to see the efficacy. You see, for example, simple drug like penicillin, vaccine, in patients improve significantly life expectancy of patients with sickle cell disease, and we need a long run to see that. Inflammation will do probably the same thing, because there is different things we can tackle in this patient. It's like, look at diabetes, education has improved significantly the life expectancy of the patient, the lack of complications, because patients get educated, and I think we should do the same thing for sickle cell.
All right.
I'm going to say one word,
closing
and
the
then I'm
gap.
going to give it to Melissa. Innovation, AI, right? Leverage what other people have done and figure out how to apply that to sickle cell disease. And Melissa gets the last word.
Melissa gets the last word.
Words.
Yeah, it really is. How can we close the gap? I think we have to be honest about the other systemic. I think we have to be honest about systemic racism. I think we have to be honest about how we actually address health equity. I think we have to be honest about what we're offering this hyper-marginalized community and not ignore it.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Great panel, great last discussion. I'm so honored to be a part of this with you. So big round of applause for our panel.
Jeremy.
And thank you.